The court of the Vaelith Sovereignty had developed, over the course of 37 years, an informal taxonomy of Lady Sael Vor-Ithana's rejection methodologies. There was the genetic assessment rejection, which occurred when the compatibility review produced findings below her documented threshold and was delivered in the patient, technical language of a scientist presenting data to an audience she did not hold responsible for their results. There was the political alliance rejection, which occurred when the family presentation revealed motivations she considered insufficiently concealed and was delivered in the diplomatic language of a senior official closing a policy discussion. There was the performative theater rejection, which occurred most frequently and was delivered in the specific register of someone who had been watching a production and found it competent but not compelling. The performative theater rejection had nuances. The full performance rejection for suitors who had scripted the entire approach, the partial performance rejection for suitors who had scripted the opening and improvised badly from there, and the rare sympathetic rejection for suitors who had clearly tried to be genuine and had not fully succeeded, but had attempted something the lady acknowledged as real. In 37 years, no candidate had cleared all three categories. The closest had been a Cathori diplomat in the 17th year who had passed the genetic assessment, survived the political review, and then, at the 83rd minute of the courtship reception, used a phrase that Lady Vor-Ithana had identified in her rejection notation as strategically deployed vulnerability, which was her term for the technique of disclosing something personal in a context where the disclosure was clearly calibrated to produce a specific effect. The Cathori diplomat had been rejected with the sympathetic notation, which was the best rejection in the taxonomy, and had left with the specific, bewildered expression of someone who had done everything correctly and discovered that correct was insufficient. The matchmakers had stopped sending primary candidates 12 years ago. The family had stopped expressing hope as anything other than a social formality. The court had arrived at the specific collective piece of people who had fully processed an unusual situation and had accommodated it into their understanding of how things were. The human trade envoy's name appeared on the reception guest list because trade envoys appeared on diplomatic reception guest lists. This was the entirety of the curatorial logic. He had been assigned the Vaelith Sovereignty's commercial documentation portfolio because his specialization was freight logistics, and the sovereignty had a freight anomaly that had been accumulating for 3 years and had recently achieved a scale that required external review. He had no other relevance to the evening's social dynamics. The court had noted his presence on the manifest with the thoroughness of a court that noted everything and had filed it under trade, peripheral. He was in the corner near the east window. Lady Sael Vor-Ithana was. At the moment she stopped being in the middle of the room, in the 41st minute of a conversation with Senator Velkorath about the upcoming session's trade framework amendments. The senator was a competent conversationalist, and the trade framework was a subject she had opinions on, and the 41st minute had been proceeding as the preceding 40 had proceeded, which was productively and without incident. Then she stopped. She stopped mid-sentence, the specific, arrested quality of a person who has become aware of something their body has already responded to before their cognition has caught up with it. She turned. The turn was not the gradual reorientation of someone following a sound or a movement. It was the complete, immediate pivot of someone whose attention has been captured by something they could not have anticipated. She turned toward the corner near the east window and looked at the human, who was not looking back with the intensity of someone trying to read a document from a distance. Senator Velkorath, following the direction of her attention, saw a human reviewing cargo manifests. Senator Velkorath looked back at Lady Vor-Ithana. Lady Vor-Ithana was still looking at the human reviewing cargo manifests. The 3 conversations nearest to them found their way to natural pauses and did not recover, because the people in them were experiencing the specific, arresting quality of witnessing something unprecedented, and had lost the thread of everything else. Lady Vor-Ithana was aware of none of this. She was engaged in something she did not have a name for yet, a reckoning, perhaps, or the first moment of a reckoning, the specific experience of looking at something, and understanding that a framework you have been operating inside of has just failed to account for a variable it didn't know existed. She was aware of this in the way she was aware of all significant things. Precisely, without flinching, with the complete attention of someone who had always believed that accurate assessment of reality was more useful than comfortable misreading of it. She excused herself from the senator. She crossed the room. He looked up when she was 3 steps away. The look was the polite reflex of a man in a working corner who has become aware that someone is approaching, not startled, not performing awareness, simply registering that a new variable had entered his immediate vicinity and acknowledging it with the basic courtesy of eye contact. He had green eyes, she noted, which was a human characteristic she had encountered in the documentation and was experiencing for the first time in actual proximity, and which her brain had apparently decided was relevant information worth filing in a location that was not the professional assessment register. "I apologize for interrupting," she said. This was not what she had intended to say. She had intended, in the 6 steps between her previous position and this one, during which she had experienced the specific, dawning horror of a person who has committed to an action before fully developing a plan for the action, to begin with something more composed than an apology. The apology had arrived before the composed opening, because the apology was accurate, and she was a person who defaulted to accuracy when other options failed. He looked at the manifest in his hand, and then at her with the expression of a man for whom the manifest and the arrival of an apologizing stranger occupied different categories, and who was making the appropriate transition between them. "You're not interrupting," he said. "The manifest isn't going anywhere." "You're working," she said. "I'm waiting," he said. "There's a document I'm expecting. The manifest is what I'm doing while I wait." He tilted it slightly, the unconscious angle of someone who had been doing something for long enough that sharing it was the natural gesture of hospitality. Cargo discrepancy. 3 years of accumulated anomaly in the sovereignty's commercial freight records. Someone has been miscoding the weight classifications on a specific category of goods, and I've traced it to this consignment series, but I need the original filing to confirm it. She looked at the manifest. She looked at it with the genuine attention of someone who had found the subject unexpected and was adjusting to the fact that unexpected was interesting rather than unwelcome. "Which category of goods?" she said. "Biological specimens for research transfer," he said. "The weight discrepancy is consistent with something being added to the consignment that isn't on the manifest. The pattern is regular enough to be intentional." He paused, in the way of someone who has been talking about their work and has registered that they may have been talking about their work at length to a stranger. "I'm Davin Rourke, trade envoy, commercial documentation." "Sael Vor-Ithana," she said. He processed this with the neutral expression of a man for whom the name Sael Vor-Ithana was a sequence of sounds he was now associating with a face rather than a social and historical context. "Are you in commercial or—" "I am not in commercial," she said. "Right," he said. He glanced at the room in the brief way of someone calibrating their situational understanding. "Diplomatic, then. The reception is a diplomatic event." He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has successfully placed himself in the correct category of situation. "Are you expecting anyone to deliver a document to you as well, or—" "No," she said. "Then you're just at the reception." "Yes," she said. He nodded with the equanimity of someone for whom this was a complete and satisfying explanation. He gestured at the second chair, which he was not using, with the casual hospitality of someone who has a corner and is willing to share it. "There's a chair," he said. She sat in the chair. From the center of the room, Senator Vel'Korath watched Lady Sael Vor-Ithana sit in a corner chair next to a human trade envoy and look at a cargo manifest, and experienced the specific, total blankness of someone whose interpretive framework has encountered a situation that exceeds its processing capacity. The document arrived at the 80-minute mark, delivered by a young administrative aide who had clearly been searching the reception for its recipient, and who looked briefly, when she found him in the corner with Lady Vor-Ithana, as though she was uncertain whether she had found the correct person. Davin Rourke received the document with the focused gratitude of a man who has been waiting for something for 40 minutes and is glad to have it, and spent 4 minutes reviewing it with the complete attention of someone who had temporarily left the room by internal decision and was operating exclusively on the manifest question. Lady Vor-Ithana watched him work. She watched him with the assessment register she had spent 37 years applying to other purposes, and which was now providing her with information she had not known to request. He did not present while he worked. He did not manage the impression he was making. He was doing the thing he had been waiting to do, and was doing it with the complete, unself-conscious attention of someone who had forgotten there was an audience, which there was, not just her, but a significant portion of the room, which had reorganized its ambient attention toward the east window corner with the subtle, practiced orientation of a court that was watching something it did not understand. "There it is," he said. "The confirmation." She said, "The confirmation." He pointed at a line in the document, the specific, immediate gesture of someone sharing a finding with a colleague rather than presenting a result to an audience. The original weight classification on this consignment series uses a code that was discontinued 8 years ago. Someone has been backdating entries using an outdated format, which means they either have access to old documentation systems or they're pulling the codes from records that predate the current classification revision. He looked at her. Either way, it's intentional. This didn't happen by accident. She looked at the line he had indicated. She looked at it with the genuine attention of someone following the logic rather than performing interest in the logic, because the logic was actually interesting, and performance was not required when the thing itself was sufficient. "The weight excess," she said. "What's consistent with it?" "I have 3 hypotheses," he said. "The most likely is containment equipment, something that requires shielding that adds mass to the consignment. The least interesting explanation is documentation error replicated across multiple operators, which would require a level of coordinated incompetence that I find unlikely." He paused. "The third is that someone is using the specimen transfer category as cover for something else entirely, which is the explanation I find most plausible and most inconvenient." "Inconvenient because it requires a different kind of investigation," she said. "Inconvenient because the different kind of investigation is not in my portfolio," he said. "My mandate is commercial documentation. If this is commercial documentation anomaly, I address it. If this is intentional fraud using commercial documentation as cover, I refer it to the appropriate authority and write my report and go back to Solon Station." He looked at the manifest. "I am hoping for intentional fraud." "Because the alternative is worse," she said. "Because the alternative would require me to stay considerably longer," he said, with the dry precision of someone who had been on Solon Prime for 6 weeks and had opinions about it, "and I would like to go home." She looked at him. He was reviewing the document with the attention of someone who had gotten the answer he was looking for and was now processing its implications. And he looked like a person who was exactly what he was, a trade envoy, with a manifest problem and a preference for going home. And he did not look like anything else because there was nothing else he was performing. She became aware, with the specific clarity of the first moment of understanding something significant, that she had been in the chair for 40 minutes, and that 40 minutes in a corner chair at a diplomatic reception was not what she did at diplomatic receptions. She became aware that the room was oriented toward her in the way the room oriented toward things it was watching. She became aware that she was going to stand up, excuse herself, and return to the reception, because the alternative was continuing to sit in a corner chair next to a man who was reviewing a cargo manifest, and who had no idea that this was an unprecedented event. She became aware that she did not want to. The third hypothesis, she said, what would the cover purpose be? He looked at her. Then he turned the document slightly and began explaining. Davin Rourke's posting on Solon Prime had been extended by 6 weeks before he was fully aware it had been extended. The extension was legitimate. The fraud hypothesis had proven correct in the 3rd week, and the investigation had grown from a commercial documentation review into something that required continued presence and additional expertise. And he had been the most qualified person at the location, and the extension had been logical, and he had accepted it with the pragmatism of someone who had not had strong feelings about the timeline until the timeline changed. He was aware, by the 6th week, that Lady Sael Vor-Ithana had engaged him in conversation on 18 documented occasions. He was aware of this because he was a documentation specialist and documenting things was his reflex. He was not sure what the documentation signified, which was an unfamiliar professional position for a man whose career was built on knowing what documentation signified. And he had been sitting with the unfamiliarity in the way he sat with incomplete investigations. Patiently, without forcing a conclusion that the evidence hadn't yet supported. The conversations had been, individually, about the cargo investigation 4 times, the Vaelith Sovereignty's commercial infrastructure twice, his previous posting once, human freight logistics methodology once, a book she had apparently read about cartography once, and a series of conversations whose stated subject he could reconstruct but whose actual quality he found more difficult to categorize. She asked questions the way someone asked questions when they wanted the information rather than when they wanted to demonstrate interest in the person providing it, which was a distinction he had learned to make in years of professional negotiation, and which he found in her case genuinely clarifying. She was interested in the things she claimed to be interested in. This was, in his experience, less common than it should have been. He was also aware, because he was a person who paid attention as a professional requirement, and had found he could not turn the reflex off outside professional contexts, that she was the most significant social figure in most of the rooms they had been in together, and that the court had opinions about the conversations, and that the opinions were visible in the specific, practiced way that courts made things visible, ambient, deniable, consistent. He had not asked anyone to explain the opinions. He had the sense that asking would produce a conversation he was not yet prepared for. He was reviewing the final investigation summary in the commercial division's secondary meeting room when she came to find him. She did not send a message or a request for his availability. She came directly, in the way he had come to understand was her default for things she had decided to do, without the procedural scaffolding that optional things accumulated. "You're almost finished," she said. "Barring complications," he said. "The referral documentation is complete. The summary goes to the Oversight Authority tomorrow morning. I expect clearance to depart by the end of the week." She sat in the chair across from him with the specific quality he had catalogued as characteristic. Not settling, not arranging, simply occupying the chair as if the chair were where she had already decided to be. "I would like to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "I have been in 18 conversations with you," she said, "by my count. Possibly 19. The reception on the 14th is ambiguous depending on whether a 6-minute interaction constitutes a conversation by any useful definition." "I'd counted 18, he said. "The 18th was last week," she said, "when you explained the weight classification discrepancy to the oversight panel, and I asked the follow-up question about the backdating methodology." "That was a professional context," he said. "Most of them were professional contexts," she said, "which was accurate in the technical sense and not accurate in the sense she meant it." He set down the summary. He gave her the attention she was giving him, which was the complete kind, the kind that did not divide itself. "What's the reason?" he said. "I find you interesting," she said. "I find you interesting in a way that I do not fully understand, and have not been able to assess using the frameworks I typically apply to assessments of this kind." She said this with the flat, direct quality she applied to all significant statements, without performance, without the emotional scaffolding that indicated important thing incoming. "I want to know if this is mutual. I recognize that I have not given you clear information that would allow you to make that determination, because I have been approaching these conversations as information gathering rather than disclosure, which is a one-sided methodology that I now recognize was not serving the purpose." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about 18 conversations and the quality he had found difficult to categorize. He thought about the specific, unusual experience of being engaged by someone whose engagement was plainly about the thing it was about rather than about the impression the engagement would make. He thought about a corner chair at a diplomatic reception and a cargo manifest, and a woman who had looked at the manifest with the attention of someone who actually wanted to understand the manifest. "I wondered," he said. "I didn't want to assume." "You had insufficient information to make an assumption," she said. "Yes," he said. "Now I have more." "Yes," she said. He thought about the end of the week. He thought about the investigation summary and the referral documentation and the clearance to depart. "My mandate on Solon Prime concludes when the summary is accepted," he said. "I will have a posting on Solon Station after that, which is close enough that—" he paused, in the way of someone doing practical arithmetic that had not previously been relevant and was now the most relevant arithmetic available to him. "The freight corridor between Solon Prime and Solon Station has a documentation exchange that I've been trying to establish a review framework for. It would require periodic presence here." She looked at him. "Periodic," she said. "Negotiable," he said, "in terms of frequency." Something in her expression moved, the specific, brief shift of something being held carefully, and finding a surface where it did not need to be held quite so tightly. It was not the smile exactly, or not only the smile. It was the expression that preceded the smile, the moment of recognition before the recognition was performed. And he was aware of this with the particular awareness of someone who had paid attention across 18 conversations and had accumulated enough data to read the result, genuine. "The freight corridor documentation is a legitimate problem," she said. "It is," he said. "I've been meaning to address it." "You have had 6 weeks," she said. "I've been occupied," he said. The expression completed itself. He had not seen it fully before, had seen the partial version, the managed version, the version she deployed in professional contexts where the full version was not appropriate. And the full version was different in the specific way that things were different when they were not being managed. He filed this in the documentation of 18 conversations as the most significant data point, and the one that had required the most time to produce, which was, he thought, worth the time. "The investigation summary," she said. "You said it goes to the Oversight Authority tomorrow." "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Then you have an evening that is not occupied by the investigation," she said. "I do," he said. "There is a consignment series in the commercial records from the 3rd quarter of last year," she said. "That has a weight pattern I noticed when you were explaining the backdating methodology to the oversight panel. It may be unrelated to the fraud case. It may be a separate anomaly. I do not have the expertise to assess it, and I thought," she paused, with the quality of someone who has prepared a reason and is now aware that the reason is technically true and also transparently a reason. "I thought you might find it interesting." He looked at her. She looked at him with the directness that was her register for things she was certain of, and the specific quality of someone who has been precise for 6 weeks and has run out of patience for the precision, and who has decided, for the first time in a very long time, that honesty without strategy is available to her and is going to use it. "I probably would," he said. "Show me." The court of the Vaelith Sovereignty updated its collective understanding across the subsequent weeks with the specific, gradual process of people who have been certain about something for 37 years and are now in the process of being wrong about it. The matchmakers updated their files. The notation they chose after considerable internal discussion was case resolved, methodology, unprecedented. The unprecedented notation had never been used before. They added it to the taxonomy. Senator Velkorath, asked by 3 separate colleagues to provide an explanation for what had occurred, gave the same answer each time. He had been in a conversation with Lady Vor-Ithana when she stopped, and turned, and crossed the room, and he had been in the east wing of the reception hall when she sat down, and he had been at the quarterly review when she asked the follow-up question about the backdating methodology, and he had observed these events with his own eyes and had no more explanation for them than anyone else. What he did not say, because he was a senator and senators did not speculate in official contexts, was that he had watched Lady Vor-Ithana assess 412 candidates with the clinical detachment of someone who had never been uncertain in a professional context, and had watched her, over 6 weeks of a freight documentation investigation, become uncertain in a way he recognized, because he had been uncertain in exactly that way once, many years ago, about a person who had also not been looking at him when he looked at them. He did not say this. He thought it was probably accurate. The final investigation summary was accepted on a Thursday. Davin Rourke's clearance to depart was processed on Friday. On Saturday, he submitted a project proposal to the Commercial Oversight Board for a review framework for freight corridor documentation between Solon Prime and Solon Station, which the board accepted on Monday as a legitimate and overdue initiative, which it was, and which would require periodic presence on Solon Prime, the frequency of which was, as he had noted, negotiable. The consignment series from the third quarter of last year had turned out, upon review, to be a genuine anomaly with a straightforward explanation. A miscoding error by a single operator that had propagated across 18 entries and been corrected in the fourth quarter without formal notation. It had taken them 40 minutes to establish this. They had spent 3 hours after establishing it talking about something else, which had been, he had noted in the record he kept of significant conversations, the best 40 minutes plus 3 hours he had spent on Solon Prime. On a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks into the freight corridor documentation project, he was in the secondary meeting room reviewing the first quarter's preliminary findings when she came to find him. This was consistent with the pattern they had developed. She came to find him rather than summoning, which she had explained when he asked, was because coming to find him had been the approach she chose at the beginning, and she saw no reason to revise it. He found this, as he found most things about her, specifically and genuinely interesting. She put a document on the desk. He looked at it. It was a transit authorization record with a weight notation he recognized as the discontinued format he had identified in the original fraud case. Different consignment series, she said. Different time frame. I was reviewing the third quarter records for a different purpose and I found it. He looked at the weight notation. He looked at the consignment code. He looked at the date stamp. This is from 5 years ago, he said. Yes, she said. Before the current format was established, he said. Yes, she said. Which means it's not the same fraud. The fraud in the current records was using the old format deliberately, but this is contemporary with the old format. He looked at the notation again. This might be a legitimate document from the period before the revision. It might be, she said, but the weight classification is still anomalous relative to the consignment description, he said. Yes, she said, I noticed that. He looked at her. She looked at the document with the attention of someone who had found something and was satisfied that she had found it, and who was also, he had learned to read, waiting for the specific thing she had been waiting for across 4 months of freight corridor documentation and consignment series anomalies. The confirmation that what she had brought him was what she believed it to be, which was never about the document, and had always been about the specific quality of attention he brought to whatever she put in front of him. It's a thread, he said. Yes, she said. A different thread from the one we resolved, he said. Older, it might connect to it or it might be separate. I don't know, she said. I don't have the expertise to determine that. I do, he said. I know, she said. He looked at the document and then at her and then at the window, where Solon Prime's evening light was doing the amber thing it did at this hour, the thing he had stopped noticing individually and had started noticing as part of the general texture of being here. Being here had developed a texture. He had not planned for that when he submitted the project proposal, and had been aware of it developing since approximately the second month, and had not done anything about it because nothing he was aware of doing needed to be done. It was simply what was happening, steady and without drama, in the way of things that were real rather than performed. It's going to take a while to trace, he said, a thread this old. I imagine so, she said. Solon Station isn't far, he said. No, she said. The corridor documentation review has a preliminary findings presentation scheduled for the end of the quarter, he said. I could be here for that. The end of the quarter is 2 months, she said. The thread might take 2 months, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the window, Solon Prime's amber evening held them both in the ordinary, patient way of light that had no opinion about what was happening in it and was providing illumination regardless. The thread might take longer, she said. It might, he said. I've found that documentation investigations have a way of extending when you follow them correctly. And you intend to follow this one correctly. I intend to follow it as carefully as it deserves, he said, which was accurate and also meant what it meant. And she heard both, because she was a person who listened carefully to true things, and he had learned that she heard all of what was in them. She sat down in the chair across from him. He moved the document to the center